Welcome to the Left of Str8 Show, where we talk entertainment, music, books, foodies, and more each week with special guest interviews of interest to the LGBTQ community and our straight allies. Direct from the entertainment capital of Northeast Ohio. Your host, Scott Fullerton, chats with some of your favorite entertainers, celebrities, newsmakers, and behind-the-scenes people across the country and around the world who make it all happen. So sit back, grab your favorite beverage, and let's start talking.
Alrighty, guys. Today I have a very special guest with me, Mr. Sam Irvin. Sam is a well-known film and television director, producer, and writer. He's worked on a wide range of projects throughout his career, including working with Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, in Elvira's Haunted Hill. He's also done some fantastic feature films and DVD special features. Highlights for me, including his co-producing one of my favorite films of all time, Gods and Monsters. And he also does work on my favorite genre of the year, as you all know, Christmas movies. His latest project is an autobiographical memoir titled I Was a Teenage Monster Hunter, which has a dizzying amount of stories and recollections with a veritable who's who of the entertainment world, with a special emphasis on his horror work. With his vast experience and versatility, it's going to be an exciting conversation as we dive into his journey in the entertainment industry, and I can't wait to find out more. Please welcome to the Left of Str8 Show, Mr. Sam Irvin. Sam, how you doing, sir?
Great, Scott. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so excited to be on your show.
I am excited to have you. As we talked a little bit off air, I can't believe it's taken me 5 years to get you on. You do everything that I love. I'm a Christmas movie fiend. I loved all the people you've worked with, and it's just a pleasure to have you, my friend.
Thank you so much. Well, it's an exciting time in my life too. Things were very slow during the pandemic and came raging back.
We're going to go onto this book. This book is amazing. I uploaded the video version the audio version last week. I can't believe it's 21 hours of audio.
Yes.
How many days did it take you to record that?
A lot. I had some help. It's a memoir. It is also a collection of interviews that I did as a teenager for a fanzine on horror films that I did back when I was a kid called Bizarre. And there are 35 interviews in the book that I reprint from those days. And several of the interviewees who are still with us agreed to record their answers to all their questions for the audiobook. So I have a lot of guest stars like Jane Seymour and Stephanie Beacham and many others who very graciously re-recorded their interview answers. And then for those who are no longer with us, like Diana Rigg, for instance, I got Juliet Mills to record her answers. And Juliet and Diana had actually been on stage together on the West End back in the 60s, and they know each other. And so it was really cool to have Juliet come in and do that. And people don't remember, Juliet was the star of Nanny and the Professor in the 60s, and she is the sister of Haley Mills from the Disney movies, and their father was Sir John Mills, this great British actor. So it's she comes from a big dynasty, and her husband, of course, is the gorgeous Maxwell Caulfield, who I also got to come in and do the voices for a couple of interviews for Ralph Bates and Shane Bryant, and even did Michael York, who's still with us, but Michael wasn't available, so Maxwell was kind enough to do the answers for his interview. I have the foreword to the book is written by Cassandra Peterson, who's Elvira, and she recorded her foreword for the audiobook. And my dear friend Julie Brown, remember Julie Brown of Earth Girls Are Easy,
Of course.
and the Homecoming Queen's Got a Gun, and Medusa, Dare to Be Truthful, of all those great things. She's one of my dearest pals, and she read my author bio at the end. So so there's all kinds of cool guest stars on this audio book, and it is 21 hours. But the book itself is huge. It's 350 pages, 600 photographs, and 25 full-page, full-color cartoons. I mean, it is just lavishly done. Lots of color, lots of cartoons, lots of gorgeous pictures, and the reason that I'm unabashed in promoting this so heavily is because I am giving 100% of the profits to the Trevor Project, which benefits LGBTQ plus youth. And you can get this in hardback, in paperback, and an audiobook, all on Amazon. I recommend both the audiobook and the book so you get the full experience, because you're not going to get the 600 pictures on the audiobook, but you're not going to hear us if you just get the print edition. So,
right.
So I highly recommend both, and I'm very excited about it. It's my coming of age memoir as a closeted gay teen who was a huge monster movie fan, and it's a hybrid book because, as I say, it is this collection of interviews, but it really is. I ended up writing all the behind the scenes of how I got these interviews. And then I realized, well, I've got to set this up. I mean, I can't just start it off with, me going to interview somebody in London about a horror film. I've got to set this up. So I started writing chapters of my childhood and how crazy things were and what a charmed childhood I had, and talking about being this gay kid and trying to find my way. And it really did evolve into a coming of age memoir. And it goes through my life up until the age of 19, 3 days before I met Brian DePalma. And that will be volume 2, which I will publish in a couple of years.
Right.
Where I go into my DePalma years, where I ended up working as Brian DePalma's assistant on Dress to Kill and The Fury, and I associate produced a film he did called Home Movies with Kirk Douglas, and working with him was my education. Even though I went to film school and graduated from college and all of that, my real learning was working as De Palma's assistant, and that's how I became a director. And now I just am celebrating. I just crossed the 50 film mark. I have my 50th credit actually it's now 51 films that I've directed. I ended up doing 6 films last year. It was crazy. I had no work.
That's amazing.
I had no work during COVID for 2.5 years, and then suddenly 6 movies last year. It was insane, and all of them rom-coms. I guess that's the new black. I normally am doing. I'm normally doing Hallmark Christmas movies and Lifetime thrillers. Is kind of the world that I've evolved into. But for whatever reason, after the pandemic, I guess they figure everybody wants a rom-com. So that's what I was doing a lot last year. I did 2 of them with Jodie Sweetin from Full House. She is magnificent. And then I did 2 with Scout Taylor Compton, who people may remember from the 2 Rob Zombie Halloween reboots. And she did the Jamie Lee Curtis role in those movies. And she is magnificent as well. Absolutely loved working with her. And so it's just kind of wild. I'm, writing books and directing movies, and I'm 66, although that's 18 Celsius, people. So I'm barely legal. And
well, that's amazing.
Who knew I'd be, this busy at this time of my life? And it's fantastic. I have a husband. We've been together this month. We're taping this interview in January of 2023. And later this month, we'll be celebrating 41 years together.
I love that. Well, you're giving all the answers to my questions. I got 2 pages of questions out of 50 that I had to narrow it down to. So let's go ahead and go through a little bit of your career, a little bit of your stories, and
Great.
some things that I'm interested in, and then we'll wrap it up, kind of recapping everything.
Excellent.
Let's start at the beginning, though, because I read you were born and raised in Asheville, North Carolina.
Yes.
Your dad and grandfather worked for competing movie chains, which I think is amazing. But you kind of first got the real bug on a trip to California. Talk about that for a second.
Yes. Well, because my dad owned movie theaters in my hometown and some other cities in North and South Carolina, he had connections in the movie business. And when I was 8 years old in 1964, we did our family did a road trip out to California, and he arranged for a VIP tour at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank. And I walked onto the set as a wide-eyed, naive 8-year-old kid where Blake Edwards was directing The Great Race, and there was an iceberg in a gigantic tank of water with antique cars on it. And also on that iceberg was Natalie Wood, Jack Lemmon, Peter Falk, and Tony Curtis. And there were wind machines and rain machines and wave machines, and the eyes just literally popped right out of my freaking head. And I thought, I had no idea that they created that kind of stuff on a soundstage. I just thought if they needed to shoot a scene like that, they'd have to go to the North Pole and wait for a storm. And so, yeah, that was the day, that was the moment when I decided I was going to direct movies. And my dad had an 8mm movie camera. It wasn't even Super 8. I mean, this is 1964. That's how ancient this was. And I took that camera out of his hand and I never gave it back. And I started making little Dracula movies, had with my younger brother playing Dracula with a black beach towel and, as a cape, and ketchup and plastic fangs. And, it was, that was the childhood I had. I was a monster kid. I subscribed to Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine and had all the Aurora model kits of all the Universal monsters and painted them, and
Wow.
and then collected 8mm horror movies that they used to put out back then. This is way before the days of home entertainment like VHS and all of that. So they had these little condensed silent versions of movies on these little 8mm 200-foot reels, and they were about 8 or 9 minutes.
Wow.
And you'd see Bride of Frankenstein completely cut to hell down to a little 8mm condensed, an 8-minute condensed version on 8mm. And that's that was how I grew up. And I discovered horror films at my dad's theater. The first one that I remember seeing that changed my life was in 1961. I was 5 years old, and I saw The Pit and the Pendulum with Vincent Price on the big screen in my dad's theater with my 2 sisters sitting next to me. I was terrified and absolutely transfixed, and that was it. I fell in love with Vincent Price, and which I made sure that I met Vincent Price. We became really good friends. We tried to develop a project together that unfortunately never got off the ground, but we became very close. And as you'll see in the book, as I got older, it really turned into a bit of an unrequited love affair. And I go into great depth in it. And it's very, for me, it was very moving. I pulled out all the letters that he had sent me and read many of them in the book, and got quite emotional doing it. And when I was having to record the audiobook version, I'm getting emotional now thinking about it. The last letter that he wrote me just before he died is just so touching. And I really got choked up in the audiobook, and I said, let's do another take. And the audio engineer said, no way, you have to leave that emotion in there. And I'm glad he did. But yeah, when I say love affair with Vincent Price started when I was 5, it's kind of true. I mean, it was the movie that changed my life. Um, and if I may, I'm just going to go on this weird sort of connective tissue that movie that had an effect on me, and it changed my life throughout my life. In junior high school, I was assigned to do a monologue, and the teacher, what she had in mind was, she wanted us to do Shakespeare or, whatever. And I was like,
Right.
I'm allergic to iambic pentameter, and I have no interest in that. And I raised my hand and I said, could I do Edgar Allan Poe? And I figured that sounds academic, and she bought it. And she said, yeah, okay, that's fine. So then I raced home. And back in those days, I used to record on audio reel-to-reel tape movies off of television. And I had recorded Pit and the Pendulum, because now I'd seen it several times. And I had it on a reel-to-reel tape, just the audio. And I went in and I transcribed Vincent Price's monologue from the climax of the movie. And by the time I finished transcribing it, I had already kind of committed it to memory. And I went in the next day and recited it and got an A. I don't think the teacher realized this really wasn't Edgar Allan Poe's text. This was the screenwriter Richard Matheson who wrote the script to Pit the Pendulum. Right. But at any rate, I got an A, and that monologue stuck with me. Okay, then a couple of years later, it was about 1971, Vincent Price was touring with Oliver, the musical, and they were going to perform it in Atlanta, Georgia, which was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived. Well, I absolutely badgered my mother until she agreed to drive me down there. And we saw the show, and we went backstage and to try to meet Vincent Price after the show. And lo and behold, we met him, and there were other fans that were trying to meet him and stuff. Wow. And I told him that my dad ran all of his movies at our theater, and I showed him a flyer because by then I was, in 71, I was like, 14, I guess. And I was already booking at my dad's theaters, like these kiddie matinees on Saturday morning of horror movie, things. And so I brought a flyer of a Vincent Price retrospective that I had been doing on Saturday mornings. And he was very impressed to see that. And then I said, and I happen to know your monologue from Pit and the Pendulum. And he said, oh, no, you don't. And I said, yes, I do. And I did it. And it was, do you know where you are, Bartolome? You are about to enter hell. Hell, the netherworld, the infernal region of the abode of the damned, a place of torment, Gehenna, Naraka, the pit, and the pendulum, the razor edge of destiny, thus the condition of man, bound on an island from which he can never hope to escape, surrounded by the waiting pit of hell, which must destroy him finally. Okay. He was flabbergasted, and all the other fans that were standing around applauded. So it really made an impression. And so then the following year, I went to see him do a lecture. He was touring at that time with a lecture called Villains That Haunt Me, or something to that effect. And he was doing it at college campuses and stuff. And I, again, got my mother to take me and saw him, went backstage. He remembered me. And because my name is Sam Irvin, it's also, back in those days, there was Watergate, and the head of the Watergate committee was Senator Sam Irvin, who also was from North Carolina like I was. Now, he spelled his last name E-R-V-I-N, and mine was I-R-V-I-N. We weren't related, but it was pronounced the same way. And, it was just it was a name that kind of stuck. And Vincent, he was like, oh, Sam, what are you doing here? And so then flash forward to when I'm in high school. And as a high school graduation present, I got my parents to send me to London so that I could interview some of my favorite horror film actors and whatnot for a fanzine that I was then doing called Bizarre. And I went there and I wanted to interview Diana Rigg, who I absolutely loved from the Avengers TV series because she played Emma Peel. I loved her from the James Bond film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but she had played Vincent Price's daughter in Theater of Blood, and I was like, yes, I've got to interview her. Well, she was starring on the West End on stage in Pygmalion. As Eliza Doolittle. So I'm like, oh, I want to see her in that, and I'll go backstage and try to meet her. So I get to the theater, it's sold out. Luckily, someone was selling a ticket out front, which I bought, and I went in. It was a really good seat. It was 7th row center, and I'm sitting down waiting for the thing to start. And I hear this very familiar voice right behind me. I turn around. It's frickin' Vincent Price. And
that's crazy.
before I can open my mouth, he says, Sam, what are you doing here? and I tell him what I'm doing, or that I want to meet Diana Rigg. And he says, well, you're coming backstage with me, young man. And he did. And he took me backstage, introduced me to her. She agreed to do the interview for my magazine. And, and then from then on, I just kept meeting Vince. I would keep running into Vincent Price. It was like some kind of serendipitous thing. I ran into him in New York with my parents. We all went and had drinks at the Plaza Hotel. I mean, it was just, it was really bizarre how we just kept running into each other. And as I said earlier, we eventually became really good friends, and we developed a project that didn't get off the ground, but in doing so, we became very close. And okay, so then now flash forward to after Vincent has passed away, and I'm directing movies, and I get a call from my friend Cassandra Peterson, who wants me to come up to her house and interview to possibly direct her latest film called Elvira's Haunted Hills. And she hands me the script, and she goes, now this is a spoof of the Vincent Price, Edgar Allan Poe, Roger Corman movies. Are you familiar with those? I said, Cassandra, do you know where you are, Bartolome? You are about to enter hell, the neverworld, the infernal region. And I went into the whole monologue of Vincent Price from Pit and the Pendulum that I still remembered, word for word. She cocked her head and looked at me like I was totally insane and said, you're hired. And she had gotten to know Vincent Price very well, and we both absolutely adored him. The film that she saw when she was 5 years old that changed her life was House on Haunted Hill. And so we both had all this stuff in common, and we dedicated the movie to Vincent Price. I'm getting choked up because it's so meaningful to me. And and yeah, I mean, it just so much came out of me seeing Pit and the Pendulum that when I was 5, that it's hard to encapsulate. It's just it has resonated through my whole life. And for those who don't know, in Elvira's Haunted Hills, she is on a slab under a pit, surrounded by a pit with a pendulum, which I got to design with the production designer who built the set from the ground up to match exactly the pendulum that was used in the Vincent Price movie. I mean, talk about hair on the back of my neck standing up. I mean, it was the most meaningful film project that I've ever directed. For all these reasons, it was just absolutely incredible. And it was spoofing those movies, and it was in the same way that Mel Brooks lovingly spoofed all of the Universal Frankenstein films for his film Young Frankenstein. That's what we were doing with our film dedicated to Vincent and those Poe movies. So yeah, when we talk about changing my life, it was when I was 5 seeing Pit and the Pendulum, and when I went to to Warner Brothers and walked on that stage to see The Great Race being filmed. Those were the two moments.
That's an amazing story. I love that someone can just impact your life like that is fantastic.
Yeah.
A story in and of itself, but that person to be Vincent Price,
Yes.
that's an amazing story.
Yeah. It
Now
really
you
is.
touched on it, and I want to talk about that. Your book also refers to a lot of stories of the people you've worked on in this bizarre
Yes.
magazine, kind of a fanboy magazine.
Yes.
Where do you kind of get the gumption to start these interviews? And I mean, this magazine's referred to by a lot of people to this day still.
Yeah.
Talk
It's,
about what that was like creating Bizarre.
well, it was, I loved all the horror magazines, especially Famous Monsters of Filmland and Cinefantastique and Castle of Frankenstein, all these great magazines that were coming out at that time in the 60s and 70s. And there were also people were doing some amateur fanzines. And I was collecting those, like Photon and a few others. And I just thought, I can do this. And I want to try to interview, my idols to put in there. And I originally started doing it through the mail. I would send questionnaires, care of Hammer Films in London or whatever. And I was really successful at it. I got, for my second issue of Bizarre, I got questionnaire is answered by Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Ingrid Pitt, and one of their big directors, Peter Sasdy, who had done Taste the Blood of Dracula and Countess Dracula. And I couldn't
Right.
believe, when I sent those questionnaires off, I thought, if I just get one of them, I will have struck gold. I got them all. And so then that issue really sold out and was very successful. I, did it through mail orders. I also sold them at Cinemabilia in New York and Larry Edmonds in Hollywood, which is still there to this day, and a cinema bookshop in London and another one in Australia. And those were kind of meccas where if you were a film fan and you went to any of those cities, you would gravitate to those stores. And
Right.
the next year, so as I said, when I graduated from high school, I convinced my parents, with the success of the fanzine, to please send me to London so I can actually do these in person. And so that, in addition to, the Diana Rigg, Vincent Price story, Christopher Lee invited me to lunch at Pinewood Studios, where he happened to be making a little film called The Man with the Golden Gun, the James Bond movie.
Just a little James Bond
Yeah, that's
reference
all.
there.
And he's only playing the title role, the villain, the man with the golden gun. And he, invites me to just hang out for the day and watch the shooting and give me the tour of all the Bond sets and introduce me to Roger Moore and Britt Eklund and Maud Adams. And then at the end of the day, he asked if I want to ride back to London in the Rolls-Royce limo that he's sharing with Hervé Villechaize, who's playing his little sidekick in the movie. You remember Hervé was from Fantasy Island, Deplane.
Of course, yeah.
Well, we're in the limo riding back to London, and Hervé is 10 sheets to the wind, sucking on a bottle of Jack Daniels. And he starts to regale us with stories about all the prostitutes he's hired since he's come to London, and in very colorful language. And he started saying he has very thick lisp, and he kept saying the word pussy, but he would say it pussy. Well, Christopher Lee, who, up until that time, I just knew pretty much as Dracula. It was very, straight laced and very serious actor. Well, Christopher started to giggle, then he started to laugh, then he started to howl, then he started to double over and just was in hysterics every time Hervé would say pussy. And so anyway, it was the most surreal, most hilarious limo ride ever, and I'll never forget it. It was just, and all these crazy things were happening to me, and so it just kept going. I was so excited and grateful that these people would meet with me, and I interviewed Jane Seymour when she was, she had just done Live and Let Die, another James Bond film, but she was Prima, the female creature in Frankenstein, the True Story, which was a big NBC two-part
You got
miniseries.
a scoop on Amy Irving, didn't you? Didn't I
Yes.
read where you got a scoop with Amy Irving?
Yep, I did that as well. A couple years later, after I kind of got sidetracked once I started working for Brian DePalma, then I kind of didn't have time for my fanzine anymore. But when I was working as his assistant on The Fury, I got an assignment to write a journal on the making of The Fury for Cinefantastique, which is a really great, very serious fantasy horror film, horror sci-fi magazine back in those days. Very respected journal. And so in doing that, then I was allowed to request one-on-one interviews with everybody in the cast, from Kirk Douglas to John Cassavetes to Fiona Lewis, who I loved she had a small part in The Fearless Vampire Killers. She was the female lead in Dr. Fives Rises Again with Vincent Price. And, I was practically more excited to interview Fiona Lewis than I was, John Cassavetes or whatever. But also in the cast was Amy Irving, who I loved from Carrie. And when I interviewed her, it happened to come up, and I had kind of gotten wind of it, that she was living with Steven Spielberg and that they were having a relationship that had never been reported in the media anywhere. And she said, "How did you know about that?" And I said, "Well, I just have heard a little birdie." And she goes, "Okay, well, yeah, we are." And it was the first time it had been reported anywhere. And so that was that was a big scoop in Cinefantastique. And then 2 or 3 years later, when I was working on, I was associate producing and production managing this film called Home Movies that Brian DePalma directed, and it starred Kirk Douglas, Nancy Allen, Keith Gordon. And it was a very low budget film. It was financed. It was $500,000 budget. It was financed by DePalma put in $100,000. Steven Spielberg put in $100,000. George Lucas put in $100,000. Kirk Douglas put in $100,000, and the last $100,000 was raised through a few other private investors. Well, Steven Spielberg came to the editing room one day, and DePalma introduced me to him, and it came up that I was the one who had outed the relationship of he and Amy Irving, and anyway, he said, "So you're the one." And anyway, it was a really funny moment. But also later, I wish I had known this at the time. But when De Palma introduced me as Sam Irvin to him, he kind of got this weird expression on his face. And then as we started talking and the whole thing about Amy Irving came up, I just am thinking in my head, the reason he sort of blanched or whatever when my name was mentioned is because maybe somehow he was connecting me to that interview with Amy Irving. That's what I thought. Or maybe he was thinking, "Oh, you're the same name as the Watergate senator." It could have been anything. I don't know. Years later, I find out that he had used a pseudonym on an early draft of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, in which his pseudonym was Sam Irvin, spelled exactly like my name. Now,
that's amazing.
I've never been able to get in touch with him again to figure out where he came up with that name. And it could have just been the Watergate senator and he misspelled it. I mean, it could have been as simple as that. But it's such a bizarre coincidence. It's just the weirdest freaking thing. And so, yeah, I'm still hoping to talk to him or someone will talk to him on my behalf and find out, where he came up with that pseudonym.
Wow. Speaking of bizarre, that is so cool. I love
Yeah,
that.
it's weird.
Well, I mean, talking about looking over your career and resume, and now this book especially, you're really a fan of this business, and that's kind of how I address my podcast from a fan point of
Yeah.
view. Does that creep into your movies? Do you use that as your point of view as you're creating a story, or do you go completely from the story that's given to you?
I'm pretty much a director for hire on projects that are already written and given to me. And so I'll just bring my own point of view to it and bring my own touches. You know, there's always something DePalma-esque in my films. Huge fan of his, especially his early work. I was a huge Hitchcock fanatic. Um, my favorite film of all time was The Bride of Frankenstein by the great gay director James Whale, which is what inspired me to become involved in the movie Gods and Monsters, which starred Sir Ian McKellen as James Whale. And we even did a flashback of James Whale directing The Bride of Frankenstein and had the great pleasure of helping to make sure that we designed the laboratory set to look exactly like it did in the original film. We even tracked down some of the original electrical equipment that had been used in the original Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, and Mel Brooks had found the same equipment and had used it in Young Frankenstein, and so it, that equipment had a lot of history behind it. And so yeah, it's like I when I approach my films, it's always I bring everything to the table of all my loves of everything. I'll read a scene in a script and go, oh, this reminds me of such and such a scene, and I'll try to do a little homage, whenever I can, a little homage to this or that. I directed a gay series you might know called Dante's Cove. Very sexy supernatural series. We did 3 seasons of it in 2005, 6,
You're
and 7.
jumping ahead of me again on my 3 questions here because that's one of my 2 things that I wanted to go of is I definitely wanted to talk a second about Gods and Monsters because
Yeah.
I think that's one of my favorite movies myself. Brendan Fraser was kind of in a new thing, and now he's in a whole new resurgence.
Yes.
How does that kind of feel full circle to you?
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm so proud and happy for Brendan's renaissance right now with The Whale, and just so thrilled for him. When we did Gods and Monsters, it was about 1998, shot in 97, I believe. Um, Ian McKellen had not done, Lord of the Rings and X-Men, and he was not a huge international star at that time. He was a very big
Right.
Shakespearean stage actor and had done a few films, but was not a major star. And we didn't know what to expect when he came over. We just thought he's going to be this very serious Shakespearean actor and taking his role very seriously. And Brendan Fraser, on the other hand, had done a lot of comedies, and he had just finished shooting George of the Jungle, and we thought he'd be the guy who'd be the jokester on the set. It was the complete opposite. Brendan was nervous to be doing this very serious film and was
Right.
spending all his time, studying his script, getting into character, locked in his dressing room, taking everything super seriously. And Ian McKellen was the total cut up. He was like right out of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. He was like,
I love that.
hello, darling, how are you? And just he the first time we met, we were actually touring James Whale's real home. It had actually Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell had lived there for a time. When we looked at it, it was different owners who were not well known. They wouldn't agree for us to shoot there, but we decided we wanted to tour it to get a feel and a flavor. I hate to be a spoiler, but most people who know anything about James Whale, he did, and he committed suicide in the swimming pool in the backyard of his home, and we wanted to see that swimming pool, and we wanted to to take in the ghosts of James Whale's life and everything in that home. And so the owners agreed that we could come and look at it. It was Bill Condon, the director, the great, amazing Bill Condon, who went on to win the Oscar for that film for best adapted screenplay. He based the movie was based on a book called Father of Frankenstein by Christopher Bram. So it was, but Bill Condon adapted it to script and ended up winning the Oscar. And went on from there to write Chicago, which won Best Picture. He wrote and directed Dreams Girls, which won an Oscar for Jennifer Hudson. He did Beauty and the live action Beauty and the Beast, which grossed over $1 billion. I mean, the guy, everything he does is just phenomenal. I love Bill so much. But anyway, Bill came. We had the production designer. We had myself, the cinematographer, a couple other people, and we're waiting for Ian, who's just arrived from the airport. And he arrives late in this 1950s Jaguar Roadster with the top down, comes roaring up the driveway and leaps out, doesn't open the door, just leaps out of the car. And he's wearing these hip hugger, bell bottom, looked like he bought them in the 1960s on Carnaby Street. And they were patent leather, and the color was powder blue. And
oh my goodness,
he was flaming like there was, like it was the end all to be all. It was incredible. And I just remember him bouncing out of the car. Hello, darling. I'm so sorry. I'm late. Let's get the show on the road, and just and that's the way Ian was. He was just such a crack up, and we were all so delighted. And, but he was just amazing fun to work with. Brendan, who, while we were shooting, George of the Jungle opened, and we had to rearrange the schedule. It was such a huge opening, his biggest opening ever at that point of his career. And suddenly David Letterman wanted him on the David Letterman show in New York, and we had to rearrange our schedule so he could fly to New York to do that and come back. And every day Brendan's entourage grew, agents, publicists, people from Disney, because George of the Jungle was a Disney film. And Brendan had originally agreed to do full frontal nudity in a climactic scene with Ian in Gods and Monsters. But as things progressed, and this George of the Jungle was such a hit for Disney, his entourage and everything basically talked him out of it. And when the news was delivered to Ian McKellen, I happened to be there. And Ian was down at what we call base camp. It's where all the trailers for makeup and hair and the actors' trailers and everything are all set up in a parking lot. And it was in the middle of base camp. And Ian said, "What? You're joking." And he stripped off all of his clothes, completely naked. And he stormed over, very diva-like to his camper, to his dressing room trailer. And he says, "I will be in my trailer." And he goes in and he slams the door, all as a big joke. But everybody at base camp was just howling with laughter. And that's the way Ian was. He was just this just total cut up. And so I definitely remember that. But the scene was tastefully done with implied nudity, and it was perfectly fine. And it didn't need the full frontal. Although who would ever refuse full frontal? But okay, it was fine. It wasn't the end of the world. And but anyway, it was just so great. And also, God, the wonderful Lynn Redgrave was in that film, and she won the Golden Globe for it and was nominated for an Oscar for it, as was Ian. Ian was also nominated for Best Actor for Gods and Monsters. We had several Oscar nominations. And for this little independent film, it was quite a triumph for all of us. Just a charmed project all the way around.
I love hearing those stories. Like I said, it's one of my favorite shows. Kind of leads me to Dante's because I am a superhero nerd. I love all things superhero. And of course, Ian went on to the X-Men movies.
Yes.
But Dante's Cove, while I'm researching it, because remember the series, seeing it back in the day, but I didn't realize that my Arrow guy, Stephen Amell, was Adam in the first couple
Yeah,
episodes.
the
So you have
entire
that
first
connection to
season. Yep.
Stephen Amell. Plus, you worked on with Greg Berlanti for Broken Hearts Club.
Yes.
So you have all these superhero connections. But talk about your Dante's story and Stephen Amell. I was surprised he was in that. I don't know why. I was
Yes.
just very surprised.
Well, Stephen was in our first season, and he was fantastic. Such a nice guy, such as obviously sexy guy. Oh my lord! And we were shooting the first season. We shot in the Caribbean on Grand Turk in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and it was very hot. And Stephen, I don't think I ever saw him without a shirt on. The entire time we were there, whether he was on camera or off, he just was shirtless. And the wow, what an Adonis. I mean, he was something. And he just had you could tell he was going places. He had a star quality about him for sure. And and his character did continue in the second and third season, but he was not available when we got around to season 2. He had been hired to do a part, of small but significant role in a Richard Attenborough movie. Now, Richard Attenborough, directed Gandhi. I mean, this is a world class director, but also an actor. People will also know Richard Attenborough from Jurassic Park, for crying out loud.
Of course, yeah.
So we were, absolutely thrilled that he'd gotten this big break to work with him. Now, it didn't turn out to be one of Richard Attenborough's most successful movies. In fact, I can't even remember the name of it now, but you can easily find it on Stephen's IMDb. But yes, he did have to go off to do that, and we ended up recasting the role with another actor named John Fleming, who did a great job as well. But gosh, I wish we had been able to keep using Stephen on all 3 seasons, because of course he did go on to do Arrow and became this huge star. And I'm just so thrilled and happy for him. And when he's interviewed and people ask him about Dante's Cove, he is so incredibly sweet, and in mentioning my name often and saying how much he enjoyed working with me on that show. And so I just have nothing but great love for him, and wish him the best. And he doesn't need my best wishes, because all these, everything he touches is gold at this point. I'm just thrilled for him, absolutely thrilled. So that was really cool that we got in on the ground floor, of someone who, really shot up in stardom.
Right.
And but the show was kind of in that era when Queer as Folk was happening and stuff. And I said to Hear TV, as we were getting deeper into it, and especially after season 1, where are we going to take the characters for season 2 and 3? Because it was very successful for their network, Hear TV being a gay network and all. And I just kept saying, look, I don't want our show to get into all the politics of LGBTQ plus issues. I don't want to have an AIDS storyline. I don't want to have this. Let's let this show be pure entertainment. Let the gay characters just be matter of fact. The whole concept of the show was the complete flip-flop of what we're used to. It's basically set on an island that is populated mostly by gay men, and there's a couple of token straights and a couple of token lesbians, but it's, gay men is the norm. And I thought, this is such a cool concept. Let's run with that and just let it be matter of fact, and not and let this, supernatural witchcraft storylines and all this stuff just let's let it be story driven and not get ourselves bogged down in what so many other gay projects of that era were getting bogged down in. It was just like every time we go to see something, someone's dying of AIDS, someone's having, coming out problems, and blah, 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 blah. We had a little bit of a coming out story in the first season at the very beginning of one of the boys, played by Greg Michael, Kevin, who comes to Dante's Cove after he's had a problem coming out to his parents and stuff. And so there was a little bit in the beginning, but I just wanted to move on from that. I wanted to just, let's get away from that. Let's have sexy guys falling in love with each other. And
good choice. Good choice.
And we did, and it was so much fun. And sometimes you really hate it when networks put mandates on things, and they're interfering in ways. Well, Here TV did insist that in every episode of Dante's Cove, we had to have at least one moment of full frontal male nudity. It's a dirty job, and someone had to do it. And,
you poor thing.
Yeah, I know.
You poor thing.
So, yeah, it was rough, but we managed to make it through okay. And, yeah, I jest. I mean, it was a sexy show. I mean, nowadays you see full frontal male nudity and just about everything. Back then, not so much. It was shocking. It was really shocking. And I made sure that in the first episode that we just laid it on the line. I mean, I think people were absolutely stunned. I mean, it was, we just had it right off the bat, and there was no looking back. So it was really fun. It was a great series.
We're starting to run out of time. Let's kind of transition. I got one more topic, then we'll wrap up back with the book. But like I said, I am a huge fan for the last 6 years of Hallmark movies.
Yes.
I watch Christmas all the time. You've done so many great episodes. I want to talk about with you the transition. I mean, you work with Jonathan Bennett on a straight acting role.
Yes.
For your movie with him, and he's gone on to have all this notoriety for the first one this past season of an actual gay storyline. Talk about the inclusion factor of Hallmark, how they've always kind of been in supporting roles at least, and now into the full frontal, and what's been your experience working on these movies?
Well, I've done 10 Christmas movies. Most of them ended up being bought by Hallmark. And yes, I did do the one with Jonathan Bennett. I'm great friends with Jonathan. I love him to death. And he was playing a straight character in that one. And as you say, has gone on now to do the first leading gay character in a Hallmark Christmas movie, which is fantastic. I'm so happy for him and glad that's happening. When I did the one with him, it was called Christmas Made to Order. It was in 2018. I believe.
Right.
And the female lead was Alexa Pena Vega. And it was great. I mean, Hallmark has they were a little slow to evolve, but they're conservative and traditional channel. And but we could see it starting to happen. They were starting to be more inclusive, starting to have more diversity of the races, but also in sexual orientation, characters and stuff. And so it's, we've all been there kind of cheerleading it on and trying to push the elephant up the hill. And now I'm really, really happy to see that it's happening in a very big way. There was also a regime change at Hallmark, which definitely helped.
Right.
Definitely helped. So that's all been really good. I also directed Luke McFarlane in the lead of one of my Christmas movies, who just starred in Bros. And he's also an openly gay actor. And
I've been in love with him since Brothers and Sisters.
Yes, he was fantastic in Brothers and Sisters. Well, Luke is also a doll. I just absolutely adore him. The one I did with him was called Christmas Land, and it starred Nikki DeLoach, who was part of that whole Florida Disney. She was in a group with Britney Spears when Britney Spears was in a group for 2 seconds,
right.
and she was a music star, and she was part of that whole thing with NSYNC and all that. But I love Nikki, but Luke was just amazing in that. It also had Maureen McCormick from the Brady Bunch in that movie.
Right.
So it was fun. And what's interesting in Bros, they have this running gag about where they make fun of the Hallmark Christmas movies and how they are now becoming more and more LGBTQ inclusive, and it's like it's a
Right.
it's a non-binary Christmas, and all these funny spoofs. And I thought, well, that's very brave of him, because he's a regular, one of the regular stars for Hallmark Christmas movies, and
Sure.
and I think that now that they're really evolving, and I think that they can have a sense of humor about those kinds of spoofs, and they're really coming around. I'm very happy for them. So it's great.
Very nice. All right, well, we got to wrap it up. I mean, like I said, there's so much we can talk about. There's a whole Romania chapter of your life I want to talk about. I want to talk about your husband and how he kind of went around. He's a hairstylist and artist. I want to see how he kind of worked into your show. We're going to have you back when one of your next movies comes out.
Great.
But let's finish back up with the book.
Yes.
One of the things I love, like you said, it's in audio, it's in paperback, it's in hardcover. You can actually get signed copies if you're in Burbank, right?
Yes. There's a horror store called Dark Delicacies in Burbank. They also have a web store, and you can order signed copies as long as you're in the U.S. They don't ship outside this country. And yes, so you can order signed copies if you want them personalized. I will do that. I drop in there frequently and will personalize them. They'll have it on the order, and I'll just do it whenever I'm next in the store. And it's a great store to, it's a mom and pop little independent store that we want to all support. So it's great.
Well, Sam, I appreciate you taking the time. It's been an amazing interview. We definitely have to get together again. And thank you so much for being on the Left of Str8 Show.
I loved it, Scott. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Left of Str8 Show. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast distributor, and please give us a 5-star rating so more listeners can find us. You can follow us on social media, and be sure to check out our website, www.leftofstraightradio.com, for contests and other news and information. See you next week.